Good evening. Thank you so much for coming, and welcome to Did That Just Happen? A virtual book talk with Dr. Stephanie Pinder-Amaker and Dr. Lauren Wadsworth. My name is Kelly Glue, and I am president of the Steppingstone Foundation, which prepares students from historically marginalized communities to access, navigate, and graduate from college. Steppingstone is committed to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, both locally in Boston and across the country through our National Partnership for Educational Access. We're thrilled to host this event around such a fantastic resource, which is sure to inspire rich discussion. We are deeply grateful to Dr. Pinder-Amaker, whom we are proud to call a member of our board, and Dr. Wadsworth for joining us to share their expertise. In addition to being clinical psychologists, they have done extensive DEI work at various companies and hold rising identities themselves. We are also grateful for our longstanding partnership with Milton Academy, and I'd like to thank Dr. Vanessa Cohen-Gibbons, Milton's first Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, for being our moderator tonight. Please join me in welcoming Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I'm really honored to be part of the Steppingstone event and to have the opportunity to speak with Dr. Pinder-Amaker and Dr. Wadsworth this evening. Did That Just Happen was a really powerful read for me, in part because I saw so much of my own experience reflected in its pages, and also because of the careful way that the authors wove together personal anecdotes with societal context and concrete tools for interpersonal and institutional change. We'll dive into some questions in just a little while, but first we have the chance to hear from Dr. Pinder-Amaker and Dr. Wadsworth. So please join me in welcoming Stephanie and Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very warm welcome. I think there's something I need to turn off on the screen here. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having us. We are just so excited to be here with you this evening. Thank you to the Steppingstone Foundation and to NPEA for sponsoring this event and for all of your incredible attention to detail in preparing for tonight. I was already moved by Dr. Gibbons' opening brief description of your own experience in writing the book. We wanted to just give a special shout out to any Steppingstone scholars who might be watching tonight. We decided that we would really love to dedicate tonight's book talk, which also happens to be our first of the new year. We want to dedicate tonight's book talk to each of you and the important journey that you are on.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. In the last few months, as we've been embarking on this book tour, we've developed sort of a quirky style called the self-guided interview, where we ask each other some of our favorite questions or some of the questions that are coming to mind or feeling especially relevant on a given day or week or hour. And we thought we could tell you a little bit about our process and inspiration for writing the book together in that way. And then we will transition to a brief reading from the book, share some thoughts about that, and then move to the questions from our esteemed host, Dr. Gibbons, who we are really excited to have a conversation with.
All right. So, Dr. Wadsworth, may I call you Lauren?
Of course.
I thought we could open with the question, maybe talking a little bit about what inspired us to write the book.
Yeah, honestly, a lot of different emotions inspired us to write the book. We were both people that had rising identities in the workplace or a number of workplaces that we were in. And much like many others with rising identities, we were in some cases the only or one of the very few. And that came with it both challenges of pushing against the norms and being different in a space, being the first of the only that someone had encountered, And alongside those painful experiences, both had the experience of being donned the title of diversity expert just because of the identity that we were showing up in the room with. And while neither of us sought out a career of being diversity experts, we had a challenging dilemma, and I could speak to mine a little bit, where in some ways I didn't want to be a diversity trainer within a program in which I was the only, but I also felt a responsibility to try to make things better for those that would come after me. So in that way, we sort of developed these expertise and eventually came together and met each other. And I found our relationship just so helpful and invigorating and inspiring, refilled the cup that many workplaces had emptied. And because of that, we developed this trusting relationship and came up with so many similar stories, and eventually thought maybe we should put all of this pain and learning and all of these vignettes to use and write a book that can't talk back to us, that can't say that training was too made me upset, or that training about privilege was not the right target. A book doesn't have defensiveness. So in writing the book together, one of our missions was to create a book that would put together all of our learning and be packaged in a way that hopefully would be validating to those that have had similar experiences as Dr. Gibbons shared, and also be something that they could deliver to a boss that maybe had a lot of privileged identities. Maybe they deliver it in an anonymous way that would be chock full of everything we'd want to say to that boss for them in a way that would then keep them safe from having to be the one to say those things. So those are some of the thoughts that come up. I'm wondering if you have anything to add.
No, I thought you covered it really well. I think one of the things we have spoken about quite a bit is that we say a lot of the things in the book that we had been sort of charged with saying in some really challenging situations again and again and again, which really sort of lended itself to, hey, why not just write this down? We've had to repeat it so many times. And then also that we had the opportunity to say some really difficult things. There are so many things, so many aspects about promoting inclusive workspaces that are really tough to say. And it felt, I would say, just echoing what you said, really cathartic to be able to put those words in writing in a format that would hopefully prove beneficial to others.
So why did we write the book when we did? One of my favorite questions is why now?
Okay, so great question. I think that, one thing I think that everyone knows is that with the dramatic collision of both the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, we all sort of witnessed organizations, institutions coming forward with a great deal of intensity and commitment to state their proclamations or their new, or in some cases renewed, commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for us, it so happened that we were actually halfway into writing the book when those events occurred. I remember how sort of frustrated we were at the time, saying, oh, we wish the book were already out. Like, it seems too late. Like this, we would love to get some of these words into the hands of folks who seem like they could really use it right now. But on the other hand, the timing gave us an opportunity to really make the book much more relevant to the incredible formative experiences that were happening over the course of that particular year. And then I think in a really basic way, all of this has really inspired a tremendous amount of intensity around getting this right, like renewed focus and intensity on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but with this sense of getting it right. And I think between us, we've spoken a lot and write in the book about the fact that getting it right means moving beyond what we sometimes refer to as diversity by the numbers to really shifting focus to what it means to create organizations and spaces that feel inclusive, right? Getting it right means so much more than recruiting diverse talent into the classroom, into the organization, the medical school, or the academic environment. Getting it right means ensuring that when that diverse talent shows up, that those individuals feel welcomed, seen, valued, and heard. And for all of those reasons, I think sort of contributed to the why now.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, just to reiterate part of what you said, the George Floyd movement created another surge of hiring for the numbers. And even though we wanted the book to be out in that moment to argue for why you need to move beyond the numbers and towards sustainability first, even if that means the numbers come second, not luckily, but unfortunately, the same pattern played out where folks hired a lot of new folks with rising identities, and then predictably, that was a harmful environment for many folks. And there's been more turnover, especially in the past few months. And so our hope is that the book coming out around this time is actually even more timely, given that folks are starting to see what it looks like to not have a sustainable environment and all the costs associated with that.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned the word sustainable, because it is a thread really that runs through the entire book and has certainly guided our work before and even more than ever after the publishing of the book and the incidents of the past 2 years.
I'm wondering if I could sneak another question in.
Okay.
Why did we decide to write the book together, aside from being able to read each other's minds?
I'd say sort of there are two answers to that question in my mind. One is, it's just kind of noting that the title of chapter 1, in fact, is Inclusive Teams or Better Teams. And that chapter really sort of is based in like the fundamental idea that like the research is just so overwhelmingly convincing that diverse teams create better outcomes. We've seen this across organizations, across industries. Like there's no disputing the facts, right? And as clinicians and scientists, we're both like really aligned with the facts. We hold a lot of value in like the evidence and so forth. So the evidence is overwhelming, right? Like diverse teams create better outcomes. There's no argument against that. And I think in a really basic way, we believe that, like that's true. And so certainly either one of us could have chosen to have written the book alone. But we wanted to, I don't even know. I mean, sometimes we talk about like we wanted to live our values or practice the values that we believe that, diverse teams create better outcomes. But I think in such an organic way, we also knew that by bringing our diverse backgrounds, our diverse lived experiences, our diverse identities, certainly we have shared identities, but also really different social cultural identities. But by bringing all of that to the project, that we knew with our head and with our heart that the outcome, the product would be exponentially better than had either one of us elected to do the work alone. So I think that's true really fundamentally of the process of writing the book, as well as our ongoing work in this space together. I believe that. And then the other reason for writing it together is another theme that we sort of touch on in the book, was just the notion of sustainability. Committing to creating a more inclusive, welcoming, supportive, inviting, safe environment or workplace, academic institution is hard work. And so we talk and we think, and we wrote in the book quite a bit about how to make the work sustainable. How do we move beyond this moment, this time in which there's so much intensity and motivation and passion and focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, to what we know, these things are cyclical, right? That there will be a period in which the attention will shift away from this. So we're constantly thinking about, how do we sustain the work? How do we ensure with every step that we're taking that we are communicating, that we are in this for the long haul? And a basic and really important part of that is being able to sustain yourself in doing the work. So a big recommendation, not surprisingly, that we have about sustaining yourself is how important it is to find your people within the organization. And I feel that we were both really fortunate in a sense, that's exactly what happened to us. We found each other within the organization while doing this really difficult work. Long answer.
Important. Should we shift to reading some of the book?
Yeah,
Or
let's
do you
do
have
that.
any questions that you'd like to ask?
I guess before we shift to our reading of the book, I'm wondering, is there a chapter, one or two chapters that you're finding are resonating most with readers?
Yeah, I think by far and above, the Leading Through Empowered Listening chapter has been the most popular. I think because it both validates that all the strengths of being a leader are things like speaking up, taking up space, problem solving, taking control, and that it validates also that those are the exact opposite things you should do when there's something related to identity that's coming up, or someone's sharing an experience of marginalization with you as a leader. So being able to name that, of course you do all those things because those things work for you most of the time, but when it comes to identity, they really don't. And we provide a framework for folks what they could do instead, which I think is also very comforting to have a framework. How about you?
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm actually glad that you mentioned that, because it reminds me of one of the, we didn't even mention this, but sort of takes me full circle to one of the things that really inspired us to write the book. And one of the, inspirations was also this desire to try to put some information out there in a way that would be like plain, like accessible. That, we've done a lot of reading and processing of books about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes they can be, well, we have statistics and research in our book as well, but sometimes it can be a little bit hard to wade through the jargon. And so one of the inspirations, I think something that we were really intentional about, was saying, we want to eliminate the jargon. Like, we just want to make it easy for people to pick up the book, flip to a chapter. They don't even have to read it like cover to cover, but go to a title that resonates with them, and then find something that's easy to understand, broken down in a way by connecting with the vignettes, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. But then, okay, in the easiest way to possibly understand what's wrong with this picture, and then what can you do about it? So I think that's when you talked about leading through empowered listening, I think that chapter is really resonating with people, because people are saying, oh my gosh, it's so, like, I didn't understand it until I saw this, and I didn't understand exactly how I was contributing to oppressive behaviors in the workplace until I saw this. Which leads me to then our reading, which is another chapter that has been really well received. I think sometimes it varies by audience, but particularly among, as we have done so many talks with institutions of higher education and secondary school academic institutions, this chapter that we're going to read a section from seems to really resonate with people. We'll talk a little bit more about why on the other side. So we're going to do a brief reading from chapter 3, titled Pioneerism, the good, the bad, and the painful. These are Seth's, Chris's, and Roxanne's stories. Seth, sporting his basketball team gear, was always the first to arrive at his philosophy class. That way, he could stake out his favorite spot in the front row, where he'd have plenty of leg room and could easily interact with the professor. About a third of the way through the semester, one of the white teaching assistants approached him before class and with a furrowed brow asked, "Are you Nathaniel?" "No," Seth replied. While scanning the rear of the lecture hall, the teaching assistant muttered absentmindedly, "Oh, he hasn't shown up to my section once all semester, so I thought he looked like you." Seth, who had attended every required teaching section, felt that familiar pang in his chest. He knew exactly who Nathaniel was, a white kid with dark hair who wore glasses and sat in the rear of the class. When Chris, as a high school senior, took a seat in advanced placement molecular biology on the first day of class, feeling motivated and proud, he recalls the greeting he received from the teacher. Glancing up from the desk at the front of the room, the teacher nodded and said, "This is AP molecular biology." It was more of a statement than a question. Chris sat in silence as the other students filtered in. After several minutes, the teacher walked over to where Chris sat, now joined by most of his classmates. The teacher repeated, "I'm sorry, this is AP, molecular biology." Although sleep deprived from midterm exams, Roxanne was excited to join her family in Hawaii for spring break. Eager to get settled and comfortable before takeoff, she boarded the plane and stopped to store her Yale backpack in the overhead bin. She waited patiently while the young woman just ahead of her, who happened to be white, placed her luggage in the overhead before proceeding to her seat in coach. Miss, was someone speaking to her?" Roxanne turned around just in time to see the flight attendant quickly approaching. "Excuse me, the storage bins in this section are reserved for first-class passengers only." Roxanne's hand moved almost robotically to reach for the ticket in her pocket, irrefutable proof that while the white passenger just ahead of her, irrefutable proof that unlike the white passenger just ahead of her, she was exactly where she belonged. These incidents are true stories that were told to us by individuals who share certain aspects of their identity. They are undergraduates. They attend prestigious Ivy League universities. They are student athletes. They are African American, and they are 21st century pioneers. Verb, pioneered, pioneering, pioneers. A, to venture into an area or prepare a way. B, to settle a region.
Why this is problematic. Seth's, Chris, and Roxanne's stories are all too common. They are examples of stereotyping, beliefs that Black students won't meet the academic rigor and expectations of the institution, that Black people can't excel in STEM courses or earn AP class status, and that Black people certainly cannot accrue enough wealth to afford a first-class plane ticket. These stereotypes serve both to limit the role models and goals of African American children and erase the existence of Black people like Seth, Chris, and Roxanne. These examples are often referred to as microaggressions, instances where individuals act from biases that are enacted via words, such as saying, when meeting an Asian American person, "But where are you really from?" Or actions, touching or clutching your purse or wallet when passing a Black man on the street, that serve to perpetuate injustice. In response to recent discourse by leaders of anti-racism literature such as Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, founding director of Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University, we have shifted our language from microaggressions and coined the term identity-related aggressions. While the micro once may have been a necessary benefit of the doubt to make the topic palatable for white people to engage with, we and others in the field fear that the term does not do justice to the profound, cumulative, psychological, and physical impacts these moments have. Moreover, the acronym for identity-related aggressions, IRAs, reminds us of the compounding nature and impact of these acts over time. The aggressors in the above narratives may not have had relationships, teaching, friendships, professional, or exposure, such as through the media or in literature, with African American and or Black men and women. Thus, they relied upon their socialized, stereotypical schemas in these reflexive moments. Whether intentional or not, their actions perpetuated these negative and damaging stereotypes and had lingering effects. Being on the receiving end of these incidents as targets is taxing and takes well-documented emotional and physical tolls. Citing a few examples from a wide literature, IRAs experienced by high-achieving students have been shown to link to an underestimation of perceived ability and higher levels of depression and stress. IRAs can also be deadly, as they have been linked to increased feelings of burdensomeness and, in turn, thoughts of suicide. One of the most insidious aspects of IRAs is that they occur without notice. They might sneak into a moment when you're focused on something else, like settling into class, struggling to fit your bag into the overhead compartment while being mindful of the passengers behind you, or rushing down the sidewalk to meet your friend for lunch. These unexpected incidents could leave you thinking, was that about my race? That was messed up, right? Or am I overthinking it? IRAs are inherently situated in historical privilege and power dynamics, such that the person who does the aggressing and inflicts pain is the one whose identity holds more power in society. Not only is the aggressor unaffected by the incident, they're also unaware that it happened, a prime breeding ground for feelings of invalidation and erasure of the pain endured by those on the receiving end. So Stephanie, as we're reading that, what stands out to you today?
I'm glad you said today because it sort of changes, it evolves as time passes. I think like today, like in this moment, the thing that is most striking to me, I think is the contrast between reactions to Seth, Chris, and Roxanne's story. That on the one hand, I'm struck by the overwhelming reaction and response of people who have read those stories and been absolutely mortified by them and have come forward to say, like, this was really painful to read, or I had no idea, that things were still occurring in this way. So it's like that piece of it is one part that strikes me. And then the contrast between, and yet, how prevalent IRAs are, how painful they are, how they can be such an ongoing, repeated experience for individuals who hold rising identities. So I'd say the thing that really strikes me today is the contrast between the day-to-day lived experience of IRAs and the shock and dismay that so many people still have when reading these vignettes and having a window into this experience. So I'd say the contrast. Question for you, Lauren, is in this chapter, each section of the book begins with a vignette for a purposeful reason, and then a section about, what's wrong with this, and then what to do about it. We didn't get to, obviously we didn't read the whole chapter, but out of the recommendation section, i.e. what to do about it, are there particular recommendations that you're particularly fond of?
Yeah, I think one that comes to mind is learning your schemas. And I think this is a really hard thing to do and a hard thing to do honestly. So we recommend folks do it alone. at least first, so they can be honest with themselves, and then maybe with others that identify similarly as them, so that the things that they're not aware of, their peers might be able to point out. And what this might look like is writing a list of high-paying jobs, like doctor, lawyer, successful business person, and to close your eyes and imagine just what does that look like. So if I say doctor, what comes to mind? For many of us, it's a white male. And what does that mean? And then doing that with things like a young person experiencing poverty, who does that look like? Or what does that look like? And what identities does that person hold? What schema do you have associated with each of these different roles, power, privilege, etc. in society? And how has societal norms and stereotypes, how have they influenced your expectations? Because those are the things, your schemas are the things that are going to come up in those unexpected moments. They're your biases that you might not be aware of, or that most of us are not aware of. And then I think just one other one to throw in, we often freeze when we're in these situations. So when we're watching them play out, we can feel that something wrong is happening, and we call it the freeze. You know, we know something's wrong, all the flags are going off, but we have no idea what to do. And then we look back and think, why didn't I say anything? And today I was speaking to a colleague, Dr. Jessica Graham, who recommended maybe just saying, ouch. You know, if you're an upstander, someone with privilege in the moment, you could just say, ouch, or what was that about? Just one word that you can have in your pocket to help you move through that freeze and get moving again.
I love that. Thank you. I think it underscores one of the things that's so challenging about IRAs, which is that they, as you said, come so out of the blue and unexpected. Even though you may experience them regularly, they still catch you by surprise and often leave you sort of stuck in wondering, what do I do at this moment? So maybe we should transition now to see what questions our esteemed moderator, Dr. Vanessa Cohen-Gibbons, has at this point.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the reading. And it's so refreshing to see just the two of you in conversation. I feel like we're all hanging out. So I think that that's really the goal tonight. So I look forward to diving in a bit more. So one thing that I really love is the way that you, as you noted, you strip out so much of the jargon that really anything you pick up is usually chock full of. So you strip all of that away, yet you're also really intentional about defining the terms that you do use. So you've already talked about shifting from the term microaggression to identity-related aggression. Can you talk a bit about the term rising identity and how you arrived at that?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. We think there, I mean, to your question, language matters and terminology matters. And in the realm of diversity, equity, inclusion, we know that terms are constantly evolving. We've seen so much of that just within the past year even. And so what you were asking about identity really, rising identities, right? Because we just talked about identity. Okay. So rising identities is a term that, like, as part of this evolution, there's been like this growing discourse in the field about the use of the term microaggression, and which is a term that may be familiar, you know, to maybe more familiar to folks certainly than identity-related aggressions. And the discourse more recently has been around the idea that maybe micro doesn't quite capture the full extent of the impact, the really harmful, painful impact that these recurring incidents have. And so people have taken issue with the term, that part of it, the micro, and replaced it. We chose to replace it with identity-related aggressions. And I just said that saying we were going to talk about rising identities instead. Like,
All good.
did I say this was our first talk of the new year? We're still, so, okay. So rising identities. Okay. Rising identities. Again, part of the evolution. We actually, it's a variation of a term that we heard from the author of one of the co-authors of The Construct of Cultural Humility, Dr. Melanie Turvalon and Dr. Jan Marie Garcia, two physician women of color who coined this construct in 1998 and are really responsible for bringing this principle and this practice, into the world. And they go around the country doing workshops and lectures and teaching organizations about how to become more, how to embrace the practice of cultural humility, what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. And we had an opportunity to take one of those trainings with Dr. Melanie Turvalon, not even expecting that she was going to be the one to actually walk in to deliver the training. This was a couple of years ago. And so she really used the concept, introduced this idea of rising identities to replace sort of an intentional way to think about asset and strengths-based approach in our language, which is so very important. And we really believe and embrace that fundamentally. And so we were talking to her and noticing in the workshop that she was really not using terms like marginalized, minoritized, minority, oppressed. And we asked her about that, like, what about those words that we're all so used to using in this space? And she just said, I've decided that I'm going to try to be more intentional about moving away from those terms, which imply risk and deficit, and I want to use more intentional, empowering language. And so she introduced this concept of which she referred to as rising populations. And so this was sort of a slight modification of that. We loved the term. We just thought it was so beautiful and intentionally focused on assets away from, a deficit toward a strengths-based approach. And it's still controversial, right? We do a lot of trainings and workshops, and we're hearing lots of feedback about that particular term, but that's where the term comes from. Anything you want to add, Lauren?
Just to validate that some people, to add on to what you just said at the end, some people don't like that term and have said to us that feels invalidating. So to name that language is always changing, it always will. If we are doing our job of making it more and more comfortable to speak up about what it feels like to be you in this organization, in this world, in this culture, then we will be continuing to get feedback about things that don't feel good. And we're going to have to use multiple terms for things, and maybe that's okay.
I love that. It's all about the conversation. So that I think was really powerful to hear. Thank you. You mentioned the concept of cultural humility, and that was definitely something I wanted to touch on this evening. Yeah. I admit I studied this book like I was taking a course, so I've got notes. So I'm going to refer to these. So I was really refreshed by how the book addresses multiple lenses, multiple identity lenses. Each of you speaks about the interplay between your privileged identities and your rising identities in a really profound way, and the need to approach anti-oppression work with a learning stance, regardless of who we are. So even when we have rising identities. So I find, as a Black queer person, sometimes it's really frustrating when I hear cisgender people of color, straight cisgender people of color, talking about anti-oppression work as if it's work for white people to do. So I was hoping that we could talk a bit about how we can work together to foster cultural humility within all communities, including rising identity communities.
Sure. Yeah, I love that question. And I think it gave me really warm, fuzzy feelings because I was like, there's hope, right? I can talk a little bit about what we recommend and how this might look in a real place. So Stephanie and I think a lot about frameworks and guidelines, obviously, given that's in every page of our book. And one of the things that we recommend folks coming to an agreement on is, if you want to create a sustainably diverse place, maybe just start with, how do we want to talk about and react to and interact when identity stuff comes up? What are our guidelines for discussion? How do we want to receive feedback when we make a misstep? So we recommend that in organizations, as folks start practicing these conversations, they literally go around the room or put up a post-it note or put it into their Zoom signature how they want to receive feedback. Is it in the moment, right after you said it out loud in this group meeting? Is it in a private Zoom chat? Is it in a group Zoom chat? Is it in an email later? Is it in person later? Let's at the outset assume that we're going to make mistakes and missteps, and we're going to miss things because we have different identities, different lived experiences, different amounts of practice. And let's create a culture that expects that there are going to be moments where we need to receive feedback if we're going to move forward as a group. So what this looks like is, one example is in my everyday workplace, we have folks with all different identities, and we try to be really intentional about making sure that everyone has space to speak, that we're not defaulting to a hierarchical use of space and time. And even when we're doing hybrid space meetings, that's something to consider, right? Are the people that are remote, are they having as much space and presence in the room, or are they taking second seat? And then actively putting signs up on the walls about, how do you receive feedback? What are our agreements? How do we want to say thank you and be grateful for feedback? And then practicing those. I think if leadership especially can practice messing up and being grateful for feedback and modeling that it's okay, and asking other people with higher level positions to give them that feedback out loud in front of everyone else and to not punish it. These are just some examples of how we can create a space where folks can bring more and more of themselves into the workplace. We should never assume that everyone's going to bring their full selves into the workplace. If we say it's okay, we have to model that it's okay in little bits here and there and there. And I think if we can create those types of workplace cultures, it does feel like a group project to make the world better, because we're all talking and sharing the space. Do you know what I mean? So those are just some thoughts that come to mind.
Thank you. Stephanie, did you want to add?
Yeah, I would just add that so one of the things I love about like the cultural humility framework, this just sounds so basic, but yet it's something, I think, to your point, Dr. Gibbons, that it's one of the first tenets of cultural humility is that the work requires self-learning, right? So that means all of us, like no one's exempt, no one's excluded, like because you identify as Black or African-American or hold a rising, it doesn't mean that like, and a great litmus test for sort of figuring out, gosh, do I have more work to do in this area, is to ask yourself if you think you're done, like that you've read the book, you've taken that course, you've checked that box, right? And therefore, you're an expert now on cultural humility. If your answer is yes, I think I'm done learning, well, you've just failed that test, right? Because the first tenet is self-exploration, and the second is it's a lifelong commitment, right? The work never ends. We're never done. We can never know and appreciate all that there is to know and learn about people who hold identities that are different from our own. We can never really know all that there is to know about our own identities. So I just feel like it's such a basic, tenet. It's just helpful to remind people like this work isn't for you or you who hold this identity, you who have privilege, you who's in the, historically dominant versus you. It's for everyone. And it begins with, you can't possibly begin to understand and truly appreciate the layers and the nuances of another person's culture or identity without first understanding who you are across your own identities. And so when Lauren mentioned the framework, one of the frameworks that we use for that, just a really basic practice that we use in a lot of our trainings and workshops, is we take people through the addressing identities framework, and we have them begin with the self-work. And it's interesting. I think it's such a good question. And especially now when people are so eager to come up with the fix or do the right thing, it's really easy to bypass the internal work first and to stop and say, oh, wait a minute, I think I need to really gain a deeper understanding of my own sort of intersectional identities where I hold privilege. I mean, I have certainly a number of historically marginalized, if you use that word, or rising identities, within the context, as as a Black woman in America. But I also have a lot of realms in which I hold privilege, historically privileged, and where I have power and leverage. And if I don't understand that, to begin with, then I'm not ideally positioned to really do this work on behalf of others. So I just really appreciate and love the question and so resonate with that.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I was just thinking back on what you were talking about a little while ago, Lauren, about bringing your full self to work. So I'm hoping that we can spend a little bit of time now talking about code switching. I'm almost realizing that I've code switched in the course of our conversation. Like sometimes I slip into my sort of like St. Louis drawl and then I snap back. But I do feel comfortable with you all. So I'm just kind of letting it all out. You do talk a lot, or you spend some time in the book talking about code switching and really naming that these are techniques that we sort of learn or we are conditioned to have in order to make ourselves more palatable within the dominant culture. Can you talk just about how you are able to bring your full self to work? What does it look like when you bring your full self to work? What risks do you feel are involved now versus, maybe at the start of your career? If you could just reflect on that, I would love to hear it. That really is a question for both of you. But okay. Stephanie, may we begin with you?
Such a good question. Just, we spend a lot of time making sure, one of the things we talk a lot about is how important it is to have shared language and to agree upon definitions and so forth. So I just want to make sure just that people know what code switching is, and that, like the formal definition of it refers to sort of the practice of moving between languages or dialects. So it really is a linguistically based. But we know in the realm of diversity, equity, inclusion that it means so much more than that. And there's been significant amount of research done in this area, that it can be not only the moving between dialects, as you just referenced, but it can be sort of the blending of oneself in order to sort of align with and adhere to the majority culture. And that can be so much more than a linguistic switching. It can be how one holds their body, how one dresses, the hairstyle that a person feels is acceptable to bring to the workplace or the classroom or the laboratory and so forth. And we know from the research that there are significant, overwhelmingly, the research tells us that there are certain benefits when people who are not of the majority identity within an organization can mold themselves and do that sort of code switching. I love that you said, I just noticed that I was doing that, because it's actually one of the recommendations that we have, that it's just so important to just be mindful that it happens and to know that, yes, there are benefits. We know that from the research, but there are also costs. And those costs are to the individual who holds the rising identity, who is maybe perhaps morphing and molding in order to align and fit in and advance. And so the first step is being aware of that, like just having the awareness, because so many of us learn these behaviors at such a young age, that we often lack that awareness. But that awareness is so important because that awareness positions you to do the next thing, which is to monitor the extent to which you are code switching in any environment, and to weigh on a regular basis, is this worth it to me? Do the costs outweigh, the benefits? And no one can do that for you. Like, you have to be able to do it yourself. But it can be so ingrained and so insidious that it can be difficult to tease that out. So I just love that you demonstrated that in real time. We write in the book about like the 3-part losses of code switching. That one, it involves like a loss of comfort, just in basically not being able to bring your full self to work. And if you have the privilege of not knowing what that feels like, then it can be really difficult to imagine what it feels like not to just be comfortable, essentially being in your own skin at any time, walking down the halls, entering the classroom, getting up to give a lecture, showing up on Zoom, and so forth. So, code switching, one of the losses is that loss of being comfortable in your own skin. The other loss is your creativity, because when you can't bring your full self to the space, then you're not bringing all of who you are. And that also can result in a loss of creativity and productivity. And then those things taken together can often result in burnout. And a fourth loss, which can be departure from the organization, like deciding this just isn't worth it over time. Like the costs really are more than the benefits in this regard. So you asked a lot of questions, and there's so many layers to this. Was there a question that you asked that I feel like there's something you asked that I didn't answer entirely? And also when you ask about across, like being able to bring one's full self to the work, I mean, it just means everything. And now that, and it's different. Like for me now, at this point in my career, I'm a senior leader in my organization. I have a lot of privilege. I have a lot of power. I have earned a term out of psychology called idiosyncrasy credits, which means that you get sort of more freedom and leverage to maybe bring in a few of your quirks. Maybe I can say, like, use a little bit of my Philly dialect, and people aren't going to be like, what is she doing? What is she, like I've earned that, over time. But the other benefit, the thing that is most important to me at this point is, I know that I have more leverage, and I can also be more intentional about inviting others to bring their full selves, to the workplace, and making that space, and sort of recognizing and acknowledging, like, I see you, and I can connect with you in this space, and it's okay, it's safe. I'm sorry, I could talk about code switching forever. There's a great video of Barack Obama, sort of a classic video at this point. If you just Google Barack Obama and code switching, it'll come up, and you'll see former President Barack Obama. I know you've seen the video, going through a receiving line, and it's with some individuals, he's doing a very formal hello. You can hear, like, nice to meet you, shaking the hand. And then he comes to face with another African-American male, and everything changes. The behavior, I think they high five, they do a special like embrace and everything. It's such a beautiful description of, what code switching can look like.
Awesome. Thank you. Lauren, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on this, but in the interest of time, I'll just say that it is a really painful thing to do, and it can be very silencing and isolating, especially when you're newer or at a lower tier in an organization, and I think can perpetuate things like internalized stigma. So for me, internalized queer phobia and thinking that, preferencing, oh, lights went out. Maybe it was the ghosts of internalized homophobia. Um, and but as I've moved up in the field, like Stephanie said, have also experienced a weird, a couple weird new things. Like one, as the director of my clinic, there isn't someone above me, and so there isn't someone to take care of me when I'm not able to bring my full self, or someone microaggresses against me, or IRAs against me in a meeting. I don't have someone to go to talk to about that. I have to decide, am I going to call in my employee who has less power than me and make them extremely uncomfortable and embarrassed? And do I do that in front of the group so that everyone can learn that that was an IRA, or do I do that individually to save face for them? And there are just all these different equations that come into it as you also increase power, which can feel like a good thing, but can also be a loss of community and support within the workplace. And I think we're going to hear more about that as we have more leaders with rising identities entering into the field.
Thank you. It's been really lovely to hear your reflections and how you really just grasp the nuance and the relational nature of all of this, also with such a pure academic side as well. So I just really appreciate having this opportunity to hear from you and learn from you tonight. Unfortunately, we are needing to wrap up. We've come to the end of our time together today. I'd like to thank you, Stephanie and Lauren, for joining us tonight, to Steppingstone for hosting, and of course to all of our attendees and folks who are going to click the link and watch the recording at a later time. I hope that our conversation led to some concrete takeaways for folks, for you as an individual or for your organization. In the next couple days, you will receive an email with a link to the recording and also a discount for a copy of the book. I think you've also seen that in the chat. If you haven't read it, I can't recommend it enough. I really hope that you will go out and take advantage of this really great resource. So thank you again, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.